Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The unshakable routine. Mr. Rogers was a man built on precision. At 63 years old, his life had unfolded like clockwork, dictated by the rhythm of routine. His days were smooth and predictable, like the soft hum of an engine. In a world constantly changing, Mr. Rogers was an immovable fixture of consistency. To outsiders, he appeared unbothered by life's chaos, stubbornly clinging to a world of his own design, neat, orderly, and uncomplicated. The morning sun had barely started peeking through the blinds when Mr. Rogers awoke, without fail, at exactly 6 a.m. He didn't rely on digital clocks; those modern contraptions were too flashy, too unpredictable. Instead, he trusted his brass-belled alarm clock, an heirloom that had served him faithfully for decades. The sharp, rattling ring jolted him from his sleep as it had done every day since he was a young man. He sat up, rubbing his temples briefly, before swinging his feet over the edge of the bed and slipping into his slippers, which were neatly placed right where they always were. The world outside stirred gently. Birds chirped their morning chorus, cars idled in the distance, and faint sounds of distant laughter trickled in from a nearby park. Mr. Rogers found comfort in this soundscape. To him, it was evidence that the world hadn't gone completely mad. The news might say otherwise, with stories of protests, social divides, and endless arguments. Yet, as far as he was concerned, his piece of the world remained untouched. Stepping into the bathroom, he began his daily rituals, brushing his teeth for exactly 2 minutes, washing his face with cold water, and combing his graying hair neatly. Each movement was methodical, practiced for years. The face staring back at him in the mirror was weathered but dignified. Mr. Rogers' blue eyes were sharp as ever, though they bore the faint wear of time. By the time he reached the kitchen, the coffee machine had already finished brewing, another small miracle of routine. He poured the dark liquid into his favorite mug, a white ceramic piece with his initials etched on the side. Holding the cup carefully, he inhaled deeply, savoring the bold aroma. It was, in his mind, the exact flavor of reliability. Today was an important day. Mr. Rogers was set to fly out on a business trip, one of the few things he still looked forward to. The flight was to Miami, where his logistics firm had a long-standing client. Travel, for him, wasn't about adventure or excitement, it was about the process. He enjoyed the efficiency of airports, the formality of flight announcements, and the clean order of airline timetables. These things didn't change, no matter how chaotic the rest of the world became. Mr. Rogers adjusted his tie as he stood before the mirror. His suit was immaculate, dark gray with subtle pinstripes, pressed to perfection. His shoes, black and polished, reflected the morning light streaming in through the window. To him, appearances mattered. They weren't about vanity, but about respect, for himself and for others. If you expected to be taken seriously, you dressed the part. By 7:30 a.m., he was out the door, briefcase in hand. The air outside was cool, a reminder that fall had quietly arrived. The taxi he had called the previous night pulled up precisely on time. As he slid into the back seat, the driver, a young man in his 20s, nodded and said, "Good morning, sir." Mr. Rogers appreciated the small courtesy. "Morning," he replied curtly, settling into the seat. He didn't make small talk, he never did. The young driver didn't push it, and for the rest of the ride, the two men sat in companionable silence. The streets rolled by, and Mr. Rogers mentally ran through his itinerary: check-in, security, boarding, and a quiet flight to Miami. The incident begins. The airport buzzed with its usual energy when Mr. Rogers arrived. People moved briskly, tugging at luggage, glancing at screens, or talking hurriedly into phones. Mr. Rogers observed them as he walked toward the check-in counter, noticing, as he always did, the chaos of human behavior. It was one of the many reasons he valued professionalism so highly. Order was a rare commodity these days. The line moved quickly, as expected. Mr. Rogers handed his ticket and ID to the agent, a young woman with a friendly smile. "Good morning, sir. You're all set for gate 12. Enjoy your flight. Thank you, he replied, giving a small nod. He moved with purpose through the airport. The terminal was filled with families, business travelers, and college students. Mr. Rogers preferred to keep to himself, choosing a seat by the window near Gate 12. He retrieved a paperback book from his briefcase, a habit he had maintained long before screens dominated modern travel. Fiction was rarely his preference, but today he was trying something different, a detective novel. The predictability of solving a mystery, of tying loose ends together, appealed to him. As boarding time approached, an announcement came over the speakers: Flight 247 to Miami will begin boarding shortly. First-class passengers may board at this time. Mr. Rogers rose promptly, adjusted his suit jacket, and joined the line. It wasn't long before he was on the jet bridge, stepping into the plane. The flight attendant at the door greeted him warmly. "Welcome aboard, sir." He nodded, barely glancing at her as he stepped past. His seat was 4A, window, first class. He had chosen it specifically for the extra space and quiet it afforded. Settling in, he placed his briefcase neatly under the seat in front of him. The cabin filled gradually, as passengers shuffled in and settled into their places. Some carried sleepy toddlers, others looked frazzled, but Mr. Rogers paid them no mind. That's when it happened. A commotion near the front of the cabin drew Mr. Rogers' attention. "Excuse me?" A gruff voice echoed over the murmurs of passengers. Heads turned toward the source, a middle-aged man with a ruddy complexion and an ill-fitting polo shirt. He was standing in the aisle, arms crossed, glaring at the flight attendant. "Yes, sir," the flight attendant replied politely. "I need to speak to someone in charge," the man demanded, his voice rising. Passengers began exchanging uneasy glances. "I can help you, sir," she said calmly, though her face remained carefully neutral. The man jabbed a finger toward the cockpit door. "Is the captain white?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Silence spread through the cabin, swallowing every sound but the hum of the engine. Mr. Rogers blinked, certain he had misheard. But the man wasn't done. "I don't feel comfortable flying unless I know the pilot is," he trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't quite make him sound like what he clearly was. "Qualified," he finished lamely. Passengers stared, horrified. Someone gasped audibly. The flight attendant's professional demeanor wavered ever so slightly. Her eyes hardened, and her voice lowered a notch. "Sir, our pilots are among the best-trained professionals in the industry, regardless of—" "I don't care," the man barked. "I'm not flying unless there's a white pilot in that cockpit." Mr. Rogers felt something shift inside him. He turned to look at the man, really look at him. The ruddy face, clenched fists, and scowl of entitlement brought an unfamiliar bitterness to Mr. Rogers' throat. He'd seen many things in his decades of traveling, but this? This was something new, something ugly. Passengers whispered, some shaking their heads in disbelief. A woman in row 5 muttered, "Unbelievable." The flight attendant took a breath, regaining her composure. "Sir," she said, firmly now, "I will have to ask you to take your seat, or I will call security." The man bristled. "Go ahead. Call them. I have rights." What happened next would leave the entire cabin stunned, and would forever change the life of Mr. Rogers. Lines in the sand. The air in the cabin felt thick, as if the tension had stolen all the oxygen. Mr. Rogers shifted in his seat, his usual sense of calm replaced by something unfamiliar, discomfort. The man causing the commotion stood tall, as though planting himself like an immovable pillar of ignorance. His voice, sharp and demanding, clashed against the professionalism of the flight attendant, who was doing everything she could to maintain her composure. Mr. Rogers had always seen air travel as a refuge of order. Passengers filed in, announcements were made, and the hum of the engines accompanied a journey defined by structure. But now? Chaos had intruded, and it was wearing a scowl and demanding the impossible. "Sir," the flight attendant said firmly, her voice growing colder, "we have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination on our airline. I need you to either take your seat or step off this plane. The man scoffed, loud enough to ensure everyone heard. Discrimination? That's rich. I'm the customer here. I have a right to feel safe. Several passengers groaned audibly. Someone muttered, "This guy can't be serious." Another voice chimed in, "Just sit down, man." The man's face turned a deeper red, his frustration bubbling over. He pointed angrily toward the cockpit door. "All I'm asking for is to see who's flying this plane." "That's not too much to ask." The flight attendant's patience was clearly wearing thin, though her professionalism never wavered. "Our pilot's qualifications speak for themselves, sir. And unless you have a legitimate concern, I'll ask again, please take your seat." The world watching. Mr. Rogers sat silently in 4A, his fingers gripping the armrest. He'd seen stubborn people before. His work in logistics often required him to deal with individuals who refused to compromise, but this was something else. This was ignorance emboldened, shouted across a plane full of strangers. The man turned to the passengers as if seeking validation. "Doesn't anyone else care? This is about our safety." Instead of the support he seemed to expect, the passengers began turning on him. A woman near the front, clutching her toddler, snapped, "We care about safety, but that doesn't mean we judge pilots by their skin color. Sit down or get off." A younger man in his 20s added, "You're embarrassing yourself, dude." The man's face twitched with anger as his gaze darted across the rows, clearly failing to find an ally. It seemed the more he spoke, the more he lost whatever foothold he thought he had. And then, the cabin's quiet resolve broke. A passenger in the back, a tall man with a baritone voice, spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you don't trust the pilot, then why don't you leave? We'll fly without you." Scattered applause erupted from the passengers. The sound jolted Mr. Rogers. He wasn't used to such open defiance. In his world, people avoided confrontation. They avoided change. Yet here, ordinary travelers were standing their ground, unwilling to allow hatred to go unchecked. For the first time in years, Mr. Rogers felt something shift inside him. He watched the flight attendant square her shoulders, her calm authority rising like a shield. "Sir, this is your final warning. Take your seat, or you will be removed." The man opened his mouth, ready to argue again, but before he could speak, another voice interrupted. "A quiet hero stands up." From the aisle, a new figure emerged, a woman wearing the distinct uniform of an airline pilot. Her blue suit was pristine, her hat perched neatly on her head, and her expression was a calm mix of authority and quiet strength. She was tall, with a commanding presence that seemed to shrink the angry passenger without her saying a word. The golden stripes on her sleeves gleamed under the cabin lights. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice even but firm. Her eyes locked on the man, who faltered for the first time. Mr. Rogers recognized her immediately. She must have been the captain. He found himself sitting up straighter as she approached. The man hesitated, suddenly thrown off balance. I just wanted to know who's flying this plane," he stammered. The captain tilted her head slightly, her calm unshaken. "I am. My name is Captain Angela Martinez. I've been flying for over 20 years, logging thousands of hours in the air. If you're questioning my qualifications, because of my gender or the color of my skin, let me assure you, this plane is in the best possible hands." Her words were like steel wrapped in velvet, sharp yet controlled. Passengers murmured approvingly, some even clapping softly. Mr. Rogers felt something stir deep within his chest, something he couldn't quite name. The man's bravado crumbled under her gaze. He shuffled awkwardly, his earlier confidence reduced to muttered excuses. "It's not, I didn't mean. I just wanted to make sure." Captain Martinez didn't let up. "Sir, the decision here is simple. Either trust me and take your seat, or step off this flight. But understand this, your personal biases have no place here. We don't tolerate discrimination on this airline. Period." Her voice echoed through the cabin, each word landing like a decisive hammer strike. The man looked around, desperate for support that didn't come. Finally, after a moment that seemed to stretch forever, he mumbled something unintelligible and dropped into his seat. The passengers burst into applause. Some whistled, others called out, "Thank you, Captain," and you tell him. Mr. Rogers felt his heart thrum with an emotion he hadn't expected, pride. Pride not just in the captain but in the passengers, in the flight crew, in the strangers who refused to stay silent. The world, it seemed, was changing around him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to resist it. Mr. Rogers' revelation. The rest of the boarding process resumed without incident. Captain Martinez gave a small nod to the flight attendant, then disappeared back into the cockpit. The murmurs slowly died down, replaced once again by the hum of engines and the shuffling of passengers getting settled. Mr. Rogers sat in his seat, staring out the window. For years, he had avoided change. He'd built walls around his life, trusting only what was predictable and familiar. But today, those walls had been shaken. The world he had always avoided, the one full of conflict, progress, and confrontation, had come barreling into his quiet refuge. And yet, it hadn't been chaos. It had been justice. As the plane lifted off the ground, soaring through the clouds, Mr. Rogers found himself reflecting on the day's events. Captain Martinez's words echoed in his mind, "Your personal biases have no place here." He thought about the angry passenger. The man's fears, however irrational, had felt familiar, because, deep down, Mr. Rogers recognized the same resistance to change in himself. For so long, he had chosen silence, comfort, and distance. But today, he had seen courage take the form of a woman who refused to back down. He had seen strangers rally together against ignorance. And he had seen what happens when people draw a line in the sand and say, "No more." The captain's calm strength stayed with him throughout the flight. It was a quiet lesson, delivered without anger or chaos. And for Mr. Rogers, it was a moment of awakening, proof that even a man like him, set in his ways, could change. As the plane leveled out, Mr. Rogers did something he hadn't done in years. He smiled, just a little, at the world outside his window. It was vast, full of clouds and sunlight, and for once, he felt ready to see it for what it truly was, shifting skies. The hum of the engines was steady, a gentle rhythm that lulled the cabin into a sense of calm after the earlier disruption. Passengers who had been tense now relaxed, some scrolling through their phones, others thumbing through magazines. The angry man in the ill-fitting polo shirt sat in silence, glaring out the window as though the clouds themselves had betrayed him. His earlier bluster had been reduced to a faint echo of shame. Mr. Rogers remained unusually quiet in his seat. His hands, normally steady and still, rested loosely on the armrests. The captain's words continued to replay in his mind, "Your personal biases have no place here." She had delivered the statement with such poise, such control, that it struck him as both a rebuke and an invitation to see the world as it really was. For years, Mr. Rogers had avoided moments like this, moments that required discomfort and self-reflection. He had preferred the predictable, the ordered, the unchallenged. It was easier that way, living in a world of his own construction where change was unnecessary and traditions held firm. But now, sitting 30,000 feet above the earth, he realized the ground beneath his beliefs was shifting. He glanced around the cabin at the other passengers, observing their faces as though for the first time. An elderly couple held hands, the woman whispering something to her husband that made him smile. A young mother rocked her baby, the child's soft coos rising above the ambient noise. A teenage girl scribbled in a notebook, lost in her own world of creativity. The passengers were diverse in every way, race, age, background, and yet, they were all here, together, bound by the same journey. Echoes of the past. Mr. Rogers' thoughts drifted back to his childhood. He had grown up in a small Midwestern town where change came slowly, if at all. Life there had been simple, built on shared values and unspoken rules. Everyone knew their place, and those who stepped outside those boundaries were quickly corrected. It wasn't out of malice, or so they said, it was simply the way things were. He thought of his father, a man of few words and firm convictions. Stick to what you know, his father had always told him. The world's too big and messy to worry about things that don't concern you. And so, Mr. Rogers had followed that advice his entire life, building walls of routine to shield himself from the world's complexities. But now, as he sat in this airplane, surrounded by strangers who had united against prejudice, Mr. Rogers began to question those lessons. Had he been complicit, even if only through silence? How many times had he looked the other way, refusing to challenge words or actions that he knew, deep down, were wrong? His mind wandered back to his first job out of college. He'd worked alongside a man named Daniel, a bright and ambitious colleague who happened to be black. Daniel had always been cheerful, quick to laugh and eager to help, but Mr. Rogers remembered the whispered comments from others in the office, the ones who said Daniel didn't fit in. At the time, Mr. Rogers had said nothing. He had simply focused on his own work, telling himself it wasn't his business. Now, decades later, he wondered how Daniel must have felt, enduring those comments alone. How many opportunities had been denied to him because people like Mr. Rogers had chosen silence? The thought weighed on him, heavier than his briefcase. A conversation with courage. The flight attendant passed by, offering drinks and snacks. Mr. Rogers declined, his appetite absent. Instead, he found himself watching the cockpit door, wondering about Captain Martinez. What must it be like, he wondered, to shoulder the kind of bias she faced? To walk into a room, or an airplane, and know there would always be someone questioning her abilities simply because of who she was? He glanced toward the man who had caused the scene earlier. The passenger sat with his arms crossed, his face turned to the window, clearly stewing in his embarrassment. Mr. Rogers thought about saying something, anything, but the words eluded him. What could he say that would matter? Before he could think better of it, he stood. His legs felt stiff from sitting too long, and the aisle seemed narrower than he remembered. A few passengers glanced up as he walked toward the front of the cabin, his polished shoes tapping softly against the carpeted floor. He stopped at the galley, where the flight attendant who had handled the earlier situation stood, organizing supplies. "Excuse me," he said softly. She looked up, her professional smile returning. "Yes, sir? Can I help you with something?" "I was wondering," he hesitated, feeling suddenly unsure of himself. "Would it be possible to speak with the captain?" "Just briefly." The flight attendant's smile faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "Is everything all right, sir?" "Yes," he assured her. I'd like to thank her." The attendant's expression softened. "I'll check with her, sir. Please wait here." Mr. Rogers stood awkwardly, his hands clasped in front of him. Passengers continued to watch him curiously, but he ignored them. A moment later, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Martinez stepped out. Her presence seemed larger up close, confident, assured, yet approachable. She tilted her head slightly, looking at him with calm curiosity. "You wanted to speak with me?" she asked. Mr. Rogers cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how small his voice sounded compared to hers. "Yes, Captain. I just wanted to thank you for earlier." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her dark eyes, understanding, perhaps. "Thank me?" He nodded. "What you said to that man, it was the right thing to say. You handled it with grace, and I admire that." Captain Martinez smiled faintly. "I appreciate that, sir. It's part of the job." "Maybe," he said, forcing himself to continue. "But I think it's more than that. You didn't just do your job, you stood up for yourself, for your crew, for all of us. And I respect that." For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Finally, Captain Martinez spoke, her voice softer now. "Thank you, sir. It's not always easy, but someone has to set the example." Mr. Rogers nodded, understanding her words more deeply than he expected. "You're right," he said quietly. "Someone has to." She gave him a final nod and returned to the cockpit, the door closing firmly behind her. Mr. Rogers turned and walked back to his seat, feeling the eyes of passengers on him. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't care. He settled into 4A, his thoughts swirling like the clouds outside the window. The power of one step. As the flight continued, Mr. Rogers felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a dramatic change, not yet. But it was a start. For years, he had chosen silence and comfort, telling himself that standing up wasn't his responsibility. But today, Captain Martinez had shown him that courage wasn't about grand gestures, it was about speaking up when it mattered, about drawing a line and refusing to let it be crossed. The angry man had lost today, not just because of the captain, but because the passengers had refused to support him. The world, it seemed, was no longer willing to tolerate ignorance the way it once had. And for the first time in his life, Mr. Rogers realized he didn't want to be left behind. He thought about Daniel, his old colleague, and about all the other moments in his life when he had chosen to look away. Not anymore, he thought. It was a small promise, whispered only to himself, but it felt significant. As the plane began its descent into Miami, Mr. Rogers glanced out the window at the city below. The sprawling streets and shining buildings seemed alive with possibility. The world was still vast and messy, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe, just maybe, it was worth stepping into. For now, though, it was enough to know that he could change, because if an old man like him could take the first step, then perhaps others could too. The ripple effect. The wheels of the airplane touched down on the Miami runway with a soft thud. The slight jolt pulled Mr. Rogers from his thoughts, snapping him back to the reality of the moment. The cabin around him seemed to buzz with renewed energy as passengers prepared to disembark, phones turned on, overhead compartments opened, and seatbelts clicked free. The man who had caused the earlier commotion slumped in his seat, a muted presence now ignored by the very people he had tried to rile up. Mr. Rogers remained seated for a moment, his gaze fixed on the world outside the window. Sunlight spilled across the tarmac, glinting off the metal bodies of airplanes, parked like giant birds in their nests. Miami's warmth seemed to seep through the glass, spreading across his skin like an invitation, a stark contrast to the cool rigidity he had always carried within himself. Something inside him had begun to soften, but he didn't yet know what to do with it. When the line of passengers finally cleared, Mr. Rogers stood, retrieved his briefcase, and exited the plane. As he stepped into the terminal, the familiar efficiency of the airport greeted him, bright signage, automated announcements, and passengers rushing to wherever life was taking them. Yet everything felt different now, as though he were seeing it all through new eyes. Revisiting an old friend. Mr. Rogers' itinerary included a full day of meetings, dinners, and discussions, typical for his trips. Yet his mind remained tethered to the events of the flight, the courage of Captain Martinez, and the collective response of the passengers. As his taxi wove through Miami's bustling streets, he found himself thinking about Daniel again, his first real exposure to someone who challenged his understanding of the world. After his meetings concluded that evening, Mr. Rogers sat in his hotel room, staring out at the city skyline. The hum of Miami at night, full of life and possibility, seemed to call to him. On a whim, he picked up his phone and opened a browser, searching for something he hadn't thought about in years. Daniel Keller, logistics consultant. It took a few minutes, but there he was. A LinkedIn profile appeared, showing Daniel's smiling face, older now, but unmistakably him. His profile listed impressive titles, senior vice president at a major firm, multiple awards for leadership, and a short paragraph that caught Mr. Rogers' attention. Passionate about creating workplaces that value diversity, equity, and inclusion. Helping others find their voice and opportunities where they least expect them. Mr. Rogers sat back, staring at the screen. It was Daniel, all right. The man who had been dismissed for not fitting in had, in fact, risen to incredible heights. Mr. Rogers felt a strange mix of pride and regret. Why hadn't I ever reached out? he wondered. They had once been colleagues, people who shared lunches and worked late nights side by side. But back then, Mr. Rogers had drawn a line, choosing comfort over connection. After a long pause, he clicked on the small blue button that said, Connect. His thumb hovered for a moment before he pressed it, sending the invitation. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but for Mr. Rogers, it felt monumental. A moment of reflection. The following day, Mr. Rogers had a gap in his schedule before his return flight. Miami was bright and alive, the kind of city he had always avoided. He preferred quiet places, small towns, and predictable rhythms. Yet today, he found himself walking aimlessly through the streets, observing the people around him. They were young and old, of every ethnicity and culture, laughing, talking, and living unapologetically. For so long, he had dismissed this diversity, this change, as noise. But now, as he stood in the middle of it, he saw it for what it truly was, life. The world wasn't a threat to his routines. It was a reminder that his routines had always been too small. He sat down at a bench in a nearby park, watching families picnic and children play. His thoughts wandered back to the man on the plane. For years, Mr. Rogers had been more like that man than he cared to admit, fearful of what he didn't understand, resistant to any disruption of his carefully constructed world. That man had been silenced by the collective strength of others. But how many people still carried those unspoken prejudices quietly? How many people like me? The thought hit him harder than he expected. He had never considered himself prejudiced, never once uttered hateful words or participated in overt discrimination. But was silence any better? Was his passive acceptance of the way things were not a smaller, quieter form of complicity? For the first time in his life, Mr. Rogers allowed himself to sit with those questions instead of brushing them aside. He didn't have the answers, not yet, but he knew he had to start somewhere. A chance encounter. As he returned to the airport that afternoon, Mr. Rogers' thoughts were still spinning. The check-in process was smooth, and soon enough, he found himself seated in the waiting area near his gate. He watched as people passed by, families hugging goodbye, workers rushing to catch flights, and friends reuniting with laughter and tears. "Excuse me, sir, is this seat taken?" The voice startled him slightly. Looking up, he saw a woman standing there, an older woman with graying curls and kind eyes. She gestured to the empty seat beside him. "No, please," Mr. Rogers said, shifting his briefcase. The woman sat down with a sigh of relief. "Airports are always so chaotic, don't you think?" she said conversationally, though her tone was warm and open. Mr. Rogers found himself smiling faintly. "They are," he agreed. "But there's an order to it, too." She nodded knowingly. "You sound like someone who likes order." "I do," he admitted, though his voice softened. "I used to think it was the only thing that mattered." The woman turned toward him slightly. "What changed?" The question surprised him, and for a moment, he didn't know how to answer. Finally, he said, "I suppose I realized that sometimes order can be limiting. It keeps us safe, but it also keeps us small." The woman's eyes crinkled as she smiled. Wise words. It takes a lot of courage to admit that. Her words stayed with him as they boarded the plane. This time, as Mr. Rogers settled into his seat, he didn't immediately retreat into his usual bubble. He watched the flight attendants move through the cabin, greeting passengers with genuine warmth. He noticed the pilot at the front, speaking softly with a young boy who had been invited to see the cockpit. The world outside his mind seemed richer now, fuller, as though he had been viewing it through a dirty window all his life, and someone had finally wiped it clean. A voice found. Halfway through the flight, as Mr. Rogers sat staring out at the clouds, he did something that surprised even himself. He pulled out his notebook and began to write. He wrote about Captain Martinez and the courage she showed in facing down ignorance. He wrote about the passengers who refused to stay silent and about the lesson they had unknowingly taught him. He wrote about Daniel, about his father's rigid worldview, and about the small, powerful moments that had begun to challenge everything he thought he knew. Finally, he wrote one simple sentence at the bottom of the page. It's never too late to change. When the plane landed, Mr. Rogers felt a new sense of purpose, small but undeniable. He didn't yet know what lay ahead, but for the first time in decades, he felt ready to step into the unknown. The walls he had built were still there, but cracks had begun to form. And through those cracks, light was starting to shine. The first step forward. The Miami evening was warm when Mr. Rogers stepped off the plane, but this time, the air didn't feel oppressive or unfamiliar. Instead, it seemed alive, humming with possibility, as though the universe itself had changed along with him. The terminal bustled with activity, passengers reunited with loved ones, others hurried toward connections, and travelers young and old streamed past him in a blur of movement. Yet, amidst all this chaos, Mr. Rogers felt steady. The change in him wasn't a firework or a thunderclap, it was quiet and persistent, like a stream carving its way through stone. He had spent a lifetime rooted in his routines, content to exist in his carefully constructed world. But now, those roots were loosening. For the first time in decades, Mr. Rogers wasn't afraid of being uncomfortable. As he made his way through the terminal, he caught himself observing people in a way he never had before, truly seeing them. He noticed a father guiding his young daughter by the hand, her laughter ringing like music against the sterile hum of the airport. Nearby, a group of friends sat on the floor, sharing food and stories, their diverse faces reflecting the joy of a life shared. Mr. Rogers didn't know their names, their backgrounds, or their struggles, but for the first time, he understood one simple truth: they were people, like him, living their lives as best they could. He exhaled, feeling as though he'd been holding his breath for years. A call from the past. After checking into his hotel, Mr. Rogers sat on the edge of the bed, his briefcase at his feet. He stared at his phone, the little red notification dot still glowing from his earlier LinkedIn request to Daniel. It's late, he thought. He probably won't see it for a while. But as if the universe was responding to his thoughts, the phone buzzed in his hand. Daniel Keller has accepted your connection request. A moment later, a message appeared. Well, this is a surprise. It's been a long time, Rogers. How are you? Mr. Rogers stared at the message, his heart thumping a little harder than he expected. He had spent decades avoiding conversations like this, building walls between himself and anyone who reminded him of the world's uncomfortable complexities. But now, those walls felt smaller, weaker. Maybe it was time to dismantle them. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He hesitated only for a moment before typing. I've been thinking about the past, Daniel, about the way things were back then, and how they should have been different. I'm sorry if I ever contributed to that. I've been doing a lot of reflecting lately. If you're open to it, I'd love to reconnect and hear your story. He pressed send, half expecting silence, but within minutes, a response came. I appreciate that, Rogers. It takes courage to look back. I'd be happy to catch up. Here's my number, let's talk soon. Mr. Rogers sat back, the phone resting in his lap. It was a small thing, one message, one conversation, but it felt like the first step of something much larger. For decades, he had avoided the weight of his silence, telling himself he wasn't responsible. But now he understood, silence had been a choice, and it was never the right one. The journey home. The next morning, Mr. Rogers boarded his flight home. The early light streamed through the terminal windows as passengers lined up to board, each one carrying their own stories and journeys. As he settled into his seat, he glanced at the passengers around him with new eyes, open eyes. The cabin doors closed, and the hum of the engines began. Mr. Rogers looked out the window, his thoughts interrupted only when a familiar voice came over the intercom. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Angela Martinez speaking. We'll be cruising at 35,000 feet today on our way to Atlanta. A faint smile tugged at Mr. Rogers' lips. It seemed fitting that she, the woman whose quiet strength had begun this shift within him, would be the one flying him home. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration, not just for her skill as a pilot but for the way she carried herself, unapologetically and boldly. As the plane ascended into the sky, Mr. Rogers pulled out his notebook again. This time, his writing was more focused, the words flowing easily from his pen. He wrote about the flight to Miami, about the ignorant passenger who had forced a confrontation he could no longer ignore. He wrote about Captain Martinez, whose courage had shown him that standing up doesn't always mean shouting, it can also mean steady resolve. Finally, he wrote about himself, about a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding change, only to realize it was unavoidable. Necessary, even. I cannot change the past, he wrote, but I can choose how I move forward. Silence may have been my habit, but it will not be my legacy. A conversation that matters. When Mr. Rogers landed back home, he felt lighter, as though he had shed a weight he didn't even know he'd been carrying. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. Daniel's number was saved in his contacts now, sitting there like a doorway waiting to be opened. After a deep breath, he dialed. The line rang only twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Daniel," Mr. Rogers said, his voice steady. "It's Roger Rogers." There was a pause, then a chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. I didn't think you'd actually call." "I wasn't sure I would, either," Mr. Rogers admitted, though his tone was light. "But here I am." Daniel's voice softened. "I'm glad you did. It's been a long time, hasn't it?" "It has," Mr. Rogers agreed. "Too long. And I want to hear your story, Daniel." "I think it's time I listened." For the next hour, they spoke about their lives, their careers, and the years that had passed. Daniel shared stories about his journey, the struggles he'd faced, and the successes he'd earned. Mr. Rogers listened, really listened, for the first time in years. He heard about moments when Daniel had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated, and he felt a pang of shame knowing he'd been part of a culture that allowed it. At the end of the call, Daniel said something that stayed with him. "It's not too late, Rogers. People like you? You still have a role to play. The world's changing, but we need people who are willing to change with it. A new path forward." In the weeks that followed, Mr. Rogers began to notice the world differently. He paid attention to the conversations happening around him, the voices that had always been there but that he'd ignored. He started reading about people whose stories he didn't understand, about cultures, challenges, and triumphs that had always existed beyond the edges of his narrow world. At work, he spoke up for the first time when a colleague made an offhand comment about a new hire who didn't seem like the right fit. He asked questions when before he would have stayed silent. And when someone looked to him, the elder executive, for approval of the status quo, Mr. Rogers simply shook his head. "We can do better," he said. The final flight. Months later, Mr. Rogers found himself back at the airport, this time for a vacation, a real vacation, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. As he settled into his seat, he heard a familiar voice come over the intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Angela Martinez. Welcome aboard." Mr. Rogers smiled, a genuine smile that felt earned. He had a long way to go, change was not something that happened overnight. But as the engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, Mr. Rogers felt something he hadn't felt in decades, hope. The man who had once clung to routine and familiarity now looked at the horizon with open eyes. It was vast and unpredictable, but that was the beauty of it. For the first time, Mr. Rogers wasn't afraid to face it.